In the shadows of Meridian Palace, where centuries of secrets sleep beneath marble floors and golden chandeliers, night security guard Marcus Webb thought his biggest concern would be drunk tourists trying to climb the gates. He was wrong. Dead wrong. What he discovered in the forgotten basement archives on that stormy October night would shake the very foundations of the Kingdom of Valdoria and force him to question everything he believed about loyalty, truth, and the price of silence. Some secrets are buried for good reason, and some people will kill to keep them that way. The rain hammered against the tall windows of Meridian Palace like angry fists, each drop catching the amber glow of the security lights that lined the ancient corridors. Marcus Webb adjusted his flashlight and checked his watch for the third time in 10 minutes. 2:15 in the morning, and he still had 3 hours left on his shift. The palace felt different at night, as if the weight of 800 years of history pressed down harder when the tourists and staff were gone. Marcus had been working security at the palace for 7 years, ever since his discharge from the army. It was steady work, decent pay, and usually quiet. The most excitement he typically saw was the occasional drunk trying to scale the perimeter fence, or teenagers sneaking onto the grounds for midnight photos. Tonight felt different, though. The storm outside seemed to echo through the vast halls, making every shadow dance and every creak sound ominous. He was making his rounds through the east wing when he noticed something odd. The door to the basement archives, which was supposed to remain locked at all times, was slightly ajar. A thin line of light seeped from beneath it, barely visible but definitely there. Marcus frowned, pulling out his radio to check with the main security desk. "Control, this is Marcus. Do we have anyone authorized in the basement archives tonight?" Static crackled through the speaker before the voice of his supervisor, Janet, came through. "Negative, Marcus. That area should be completely secure. What's your status?" "Doors open and there's light coming from inside. I'm going to investigate." "Copy that. Be careful down there. Those old stairs can be treacherous." Marcus clipped the radio back to his belt and approached the heavy wooden door. He could hear something now. Faint sounds coming from below. Footsteps, maybe. And what sounded like papers rustling. His heart began to beat faster. In 7 years, he had never encountered an actual security breach. The palace had excellent security systems, multiple layers of protection, and a reputation that kept most troublemakers away. He pushed the door open slowly, wincing as the old hinges creaked. The basement archive stretched out below him, a maze of stone corridors lined with filing cabinets, document boxes, and climate-controlled storage units. The air smelled of old paper and preservatives, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of centuries of accumulated history. The sounds were definitely coming from deeper in the archives, somewhere among the rows of storage units that housed the kingdom's most sensitive historical documents. Marcus descended the stone steps carefully, his footsteps echoing despite his efforts to move quietly. The lighting down here was minimal, just enough to navigate safely, which made his flashlight beam seem unnaturally bright as it cut through the shadows. As he moved deeper into the archives, the sounds became clearer. Someone was definitely down here, moving around with purpose. Marcus could hear drawers opening and closing, papers being shuffled, and occasionally a muttered curse or comment. He crept forward, using the tall filing cabinets as cover, until he could finally see who was in the restricted area. A woman in an expensive coat was hunched over an open filing cabinet, her blonde hair catching the overhead light. She held a small handheld scanner in one hand and was methodically working through a stack of documents, scanning some and setting others aside. Marcus didn't recognize her, but something about her demeanor suggested she belonged here, that she had every right to be conducting business in the middle of the night in one of the most secure areas of the palace. That confidence made Marcus hesitate. Perhaps this was authorized after all, and he simply hadn't been informed. It wouldn't be the first time the security staff had been kept out of the loop on sensitive operations. He was about to announce his presence when the woman spoke into a small device he hadn't noticed before. "The original incident reports are more detailed than we anticipated," she said quietly. "There are witness statements that weren't included in the official version, and several photographs that show inconsistencies in the timeline." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. The woman paused in her work, listening to whoever was on the other end of the communication device. "Yes, I understand the implications," she continued. "If these documents ever came to light, they would completely undermine the official narrative. The public would demand answers we can't provide." She began scanning documents more rapidly now, her movements becoming increasingly urgent. Marcus realized he was witnessing something far more serious than a simple security breach. This woman was systematically documenting or removing evidence related to some kind of historical event. Something significant enough that people were willing to risk breaking into the royal archives to access it. "I need another 20 minutes to finish this section," the woman said into her device. "The modifications need to be seamless, nothing that would raise suspicions during routine reviews." Modifications. Marcus felt his mouth go dry. This wasn't just unauthorized access to historical documents. This was active tampering with official records, possibly altering evidence of something that had happened decades ago. The implications of what he was witnessing began to sink in. These weren't just any archives. They contained the official records of the kingdom, including incident reports, investigations, and testimonies that formed the basis of historical fact. Marcus knew he had to act, but he also knew he was in over his head. This woman clearly wasn't working alone, and the level of access she had suggested connections far beyond what a simple security guard could handle. He needed backup, but he also needed evidence of what was happening. He carefully pulled out his phone and began recording, making sure to capture both the woman's face and her activities. The quality wasn't perfect in the low light, but it would be enough to prove that someone had been tampering with official documents. As he recorded, he tried to position himself to get a better view of which files she was accessing. The filing cabinet she was working on was labeled Incident Reports 1995-199, and the specific section she was focused on appeared to be from 1997. Marcus couldn't see the exact documents from his position, but he could tell they were substantial reports with multiple photographs and witness statements attached. "The backup copies in the digital archive have already been modified," the woman continued her conversation. "Once I finish updating these physical records, there will be no evidence that the official story was ever different." Marcus felt sick to his stomach. Whatever had happened in 1997, someone was going to enormous lengths to ensure that the true version never came to light. The woman's words suggested a coordinated effort involving multiple people with high-level access to both physical and digital archives. As he continued recording, Marcus tried to think through his options. He could confront the woman directly, but she might have accomplices nearby, and he had no idea how dangerous the situation might become. He could call for backup, but by the time other security personnel arrived, she might be gone with whatever evidence she was altering. He could try to follow her when she left, but that would mean leaving his post and potentially losing the only proof he had of what was happening. The decision was made for him when the woman suddenly stopped her work and looked directly in his direction. For a moment, they stared at each other across the dimly lit archives, both frozen in place. Then, her expression shifted from surprise to something much more dangerous.
"You shouldn't be here,"
she said calmly, but there was a threat in her voice that made Marcus's blood run cold.
"Neither should you," Marcus replied, trying to keep his voice steady.
"This area is restricted, and you're tampering with official documents." The woman smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into, Mr. Webb. Some things are better left buried." The fact that she knew his name sent another wave of fear through Marcus. This wasn't a random break-in, or even a simple case of unauthorized access. This was part of something much larger, and somehow they knew enough about the security staff to identify him personally. "I'm calling this in," Marcus said, reaching for his radio. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," the woman replied. "You have a daughter, don't you? Emma, 12 years old, attends St. Margaret's School?" Marcus froze, his hand halfway to his radio. The threat was unmistakable, and the casual way she mentioned his daughter's name and school made it clear that they had been prepared for this possibility. "This doesn't have to become complicated," the woman continued, returning to her work as if the conversation was over. "You can forget what you saw here tonight, continue your rounds, and file a routine report." Nothing unusual happened. Nothing at all. But Marcus couldn't forget what he had seen, and more importantly, he couldn't ignore what it meant. Whatever was in those 1997 files was significant enough that people were willing to threaten his family to keep it hidden. The woman had essentially confirmed that there was an official story about some incident, and that the true version of events was being systematically erased from the historical record. As the woman continued her work, Marcus made a decision that would change his life forever. He quietly backed away from the filing area, keeping his phone recording until he was out of sight, then made his way back toward the stairs. But instead of leaving the basement entirely, he found a hiding spot behind a large storage unit where he could observe the exit and see when the woman left. 23 minutes later, she emerged from the archives carrying a small briefcase that hadn't been there when she arrived. She moved confidently through the basement corridors, clearly familiar with the layout, and headed for a different exit than the one Marcus had used to enter. As she passed under one of the overhead lights, Marcus got a clear view of her face and continued recording. After she disappeared up another staircase, Marcus waited several more minutes before returning to investigate the filing cabinet she had been working on. The incident reports 1999 section looked normal at first glance, but when he examined it more closely, he could see subtle signs of tampering. Some files appeared newer than others, as if they had been recently reprinted. Several folders that should have contained multiple documents seemed unusually thin. Most telling of all, when Marcus checked the digital tracking system that monitored access to the archives, there was no record of anyone entering the basement that night. Somehow, the woman had managed to bypass not just the physical security measures, but also the electronic monitoring systems that were supposed to create an audit trail of everyone who accessed the sensitive documents. Marcus spent the rest of his shift trying to process what he had witnessed. By the time his replacement arrived at 6 a.m, he had made up his mind about what he needed to do. This wasn't something he could handle through normal security channels, especially given the woman's knowledge of his personal information and the implied threats against his family. As he drove home through the early morning traffic, Marcus kept checking his mirrors to see if he was being followed. The recording on his phone felt like it was burning a hole in his pocket, evidence of something that powerful people clearly wanted to remain hidden. He thought about his daughter Emma, probably just waking up for school, completely unaware that her father had stumbled into something that could put them both in danger. But Marcus also thought about his oath as a security guard, his responsibility to protect not just the physical assets of the palace, but also the integrity of the historical record it contained. Whatever had happened in 1997, the public had a right to know the truth, and someone was going to great lengths to ensure they never would. By the time Marcus pulled into his driveway, he had decided that he couldn't let this go. He would need to be careful, very careful, but he was going to find out what was in those 1997 files and why it was so important that someone was willing to risk everything to keep it hidden. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear, but Marcus knew that a much bigger storm was just beginning. Part 2. 3 days passed before Marcus worked up the courage to take his next step. He had spent those days researching everything he could find about significant events in Valdoria from 1997, trying to piece together what might have been important enough to warrant such an elaborate cover-up. The kingdom had been relatively stable that year, with no major political upheavals or international incidents that made headlines. But Marcus had learned enough about palace intrigue over his 7 years on the job to know that the most dangerous secrets were often the ones that never made it to the public eye. Emma noticed his distraction over breakfast on Thursday morning. "Dad, you keep staring at your coffee like it's going to tell you something important," she said, her 12-year-old wisdom cutting straight to the heart of his preoccupation. "Just thinking about work stuff, sweetheart," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. The casual way the woman had mentioned Emma's name in school still sent chills down his spine. He had been checking his rearview mirror obsessively, varying his routes to and from work, and even arranged for his sister to pick Emma up from school for the rest of the week. Just precautions, he told himself, but the fear was real. "Is everything okay?" Emma pressed, her concern evident. She had always been perceptive, a trait she had inherited from her mother along with her stubborn determination and kind heart. "Everything's fine," Marcus assured her, though they both knew he wasn't being entirely truthful. "I just need to handle something at work, and then things will get back to normal." After dropping Emma off at his sister's house, Marcus drove to the Valdoria National Library, a massive stone building that housed public records, historical documents, and archived newspapers dating back centuries. If he was going to understand what he had witnessed in the palace archives, he needed to research 1997 from every angle he could access legally and safely. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thornton, who had worked there for decades, was happy to help him navigate the historical newspaper archives. 1997, she mused, adjusting her reading glasses. "What specifically are you looking for, dear?" "Any major incidents or events involving the royal family that year?" Marcus said, trying to sound like a casual researcher rather than someone conducting a potentially dangerous investigation. Mrs. Thornton led him to a section of the library dedicated to royal history and current events. There was the usual ceremonial stuff, she said, pulling out several bound volumes of newspaper archives. State dinners, charity events, the annual summer tour of the provinces. But there was one incident that got quite a bit of attention at the time. She opened one of the volumes to a newspaper dated September 15, 1997. The headline read, "Princess Helena injured in riding accident. Royal family requests privacy during recovery." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Princess Helena was the younger sister of the current king, a popular member of the royal family known for her charity work and public appearances. He had never heard anything about a riding accident, which seemed odd given how much attention royal health scares typically received.
I remember this, Mrs.
Thornton continued. The princess was apparently thrown from her horse during a morning ride on the palace grounds. She was hospitalized for several days, but the family kept the details very private. There was speculation in the press about the extent of her injuries, but then the story just seemed to fade away. Marcus scanned the newspaper article, noting that it was unusually brief for such a significant event. Most royal incidents, even minor ones, generated extensive coverage and follow-up stories. This article was barely 3 paragraphs long and contained almost no specific details about what had happened or the princess's condition. Were there follow-up stories? Marcus asked. That's the strange thing, Mrs. Thornton replied, flipping through the subsequent pages. There were a few brief mentions in the days that followed, but nothing substantial. The palace issued a statement saying the princess was recovering well and would return to her duties soon. And then? Nothing. She did resume her public appearances about a month later, but I don't recall her ever discussing the accident publicly. Marcus spent the next 2 hours reading every newspaper article he could find about Princess Helena from September and October 1997. The coverage was indeed sparse and strangely generic. Most of the articles seemed to repeat the same basic information. Riding accident, hospitalized, recovering well, back to duties. There were no interviews with witnesses, no details about which horse or what might have caused the accident. No quotes from doctors or medical updates. Even more suspicious was what he found when he searched for articles about Princess Helena from earlier in 1997. She had been very active in the first 8 months of the year, attending numerous public events, giving interviews about her charity work, and even participating in a documentary about conservation efforts in Valdoria's national parks. The contrast between her high public profile before September and the almost complete media silence afterward was stark. Marcus made photocopies of all the relevant articles and spent another hour researching the broader context of what else had been happening in the kingdom during that time. He found references to increased security measures being implemented at royal residences, changes in palace staff protocols, and several high-ranking officials taking early retirement or being transferred to different positions. None of these changes were explicitly connected to Princess Helena's accident, but the timing was suggestive. As he prepared to leave the library, Mrs. D. Witcheard, Thornton approached him again. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked kindly. "I'm not sure yet," Marcus admitted. "Mrs. Thornton, you've been here a long time. Do you remember anything else about that incident with Princess Helena? Anything that might not have made it into the official newspaper coverage?" The elderly librarian looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then leaned closer to Marcus.
There were rumors at the time, she said quietly.
Nothing that could be proven, you understand, but people talk. Some of the palace staff who came in here for research mentioned that it wasn't actually a riding accident at all. Marcus felt his heart rate increase. What did they think it was? Well, this is just gossip, mind you, but there was talk that the princess had been in some kind of altercation. Someone suggested she had been pushed or attacked, not thrown by a horse. But like I said, these were just rumors from people who claimed to work at the palace. Could have been completely made up. Do you remember who these people were? Mrs. Decker, Thornton shook her head. This was almost 30 years ago, dear. Most of them would be retired or passed on by now. And honestly, I never put much stock in palace gossip. Too easy for stories to get exaggerated or completely fabricated. But Marcus was putting stock in it now, especially given what he had witnessed in the archives. If Princess Helena's riding accident had actually been an assault or attack of some kind, that would certainly explain why someone would go to such lengths to alter the historical record. An attack on a member of the royal family would have massive security and political implications. And if the truth had been covered up at the time, exposing it now could destroy careers and possibly bring down the government. That evening, Marcus sat in his home office trying to piece together a timeline of events. Princess Helena's accident had occurred on September 14, 1997. According to the newspaper reports, she had been hospitalized immediately and remained out of public view for nearly a month. During that same time period, several significant changes had been made to palace security and staffing protocols. Marcus pulled up everything he could find online about the current structure of the palace security department. He recognized several names from his time working there, but there were also many officials he didn't know, people who had been hired or promoted in the years before he started working at the palace. He began to wonder if some of these individuals had been involved in the original incident or its cover-up. His research was interrupted by a phone call from his sister. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "What's wrong?" Marcus asked, immediately concerned. "Emma mentioned that you've been acting strange lately, checking mirrors while driving, asking me to pick her up from school. She's worried about you, and frankly, so am I. Are you in some kind of trouble?" Marcus closed his laptop and rubbed his temples. He had been so focused on protecting Emma that he hadn't considered how his behavior might be affecting her emotionally. "It's complicated, Sarah. There's something happening at work. Something I stumbled into that I probably shouldn't have. I'm just being extra careful until I figure out how to handle it." "What kind of something?" Sarah pressed. "Marcus, if you're in danger, we need to call the police." "I don't think the police can help with this," Marcus said honestly, "and I'm not sure who else I can trust. The people involved, they have access to information they shouldn't have, and they've made it clear that they know about Emma." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Jesus, Marcus. What did you see?" Marcus considered how much to tell his sister. Sarah was smart and level-headed, but she also had her own family to think about. Getting her involved could put her children at risk as well. "Someone was tampering with historical documents at the palace," he said finally. "Official records about something that happened in 1997. When I caught them, they knew my name, they knew about Emma, and they made it clear that I should forget what I saw." "And you're not going to forget, are you?" Sarah said, knowing her brother well enough to predict his response. "I can't," Marcus admitted. "Whatever they're hiding, it's big enough that they're willing to threaten innocent people to keep it quiet. That's not right, Sarah. These are official government records. The public has a right to know the truth. The public also has a right not to have their family members put in danger by stubborn security guards who should mind their own business." Sarah replied sharply, though Marcus could hear the concern rather than anger in her voice. "I know," Marcus said. "And if I thought I could just walk away and keep Emma safe, I would. But I don't think these people are going to be satisfied with my silence. They've already shown they can get access to personal information, bypass security systems, and operate with impunity inside one of the most secure buildings in the kingdom. What's to stop them from deciding I'm still a threat, even if I keep quiet?"
Sarah was quiet for several moments, considering this logic.
"What are you planning to do?" "I need to find out exactly what happened in 1997, Marcus said. "If I can understand what they're trying to hide, maybe I can figure out how to protect Emma and myself. Right now, I'm operating blind, and that's the most dangerous position to be in." "Have you considered that maybe some things are kept secret for good reasons?" Sarah asked. "What if exposing this truth would hurt innocent people or damage the stability of the government?" Marcus had been wrestling with this question himself. "Then that's a decision that should be made by people with the authority and responsibility to make it, not by someone who's willing to break into government archives and threaten children to keep their secrets safe." After ending the call with his sister, Marcus returned to his research with renewed determination. He spent the rest of the evening creating a detailed timeline of everything he could find about September 1997, cross-referencing news reports, government announcements, and personnel changes at the palace. A pattern began to emerge. Princess Helena's accident had occurred during what appeared to be a period of heightened tension within the royal family and government. Several key officials had made public statements in the weeks leading up to September 14th about the importance of maintaining protocols and respecting boundaries. In the aftermath of the incident, these same officials had been quietly transferred to different positions, or had taken early retirement. Most interesting of all, Marcus discovered that the head of palace security in 1997 had been a man named Director James Morrison, who had been abruptly replaced just 2 weeks after Princess Helena's accident. Morrison's replacement, Director Patricia Langford, had immediately implemented sweeping changes to security protocols, staff background checks, and access procedures for sensitive areas of the palace. Marcus realized that if he was going to get to the truth of what happened in 1997, he needed to find Director Morrison and hear his side of the story. According to his research, Morrison was still alive and living in retirement in a small town about 2 hours' drive from the capital. It would be risky to contact him directly, but Marcus was running out of safe options for getting the information he needed. As he prepared for bed, Marcus made a decision that would either help him solve the mystery of 1997 or put him in more danger than he had ever imagined. Tomorrow, he was going to take a personal day and drive to meet the man who had been responsible for palace security when Princess Helena's riding accident had changed everything. Part 3. The drive to Millbrook took Marcus through some of Valdoria's most beautiful countryside. rolling hills dotted with small farms and ancient stone walls that had stood for centuries. Under different circumstances, he might have enjoyed the scenery and the peaceful break from city life. Instead, he spent the 2-hour journey checking his mirrors obsessively and rehearsing what he would say to James Morrison, assuming the former palace security director would even agree to speak with him. Marcus had called in sick to work that morning, something he rarely did and hoped wouldn't draw additional attention to his activities. He had also arranged for Emma to spend another night at his sister's house, ostensibly because he wasn't feeling well and didn't want to risk getting her sick. The lies were piling up, but Marcus told himself they were necessary to protect the people he cared about. Millbrook was exactly the kind of place where someone might choose to retire after a career in high-pressure government service. The town had fewer than 5,000 residents, a picturesque main street lined with local shops and cafes, and the kind of quiet atmosphere that suggested people here minded their own business and valued their privacy. Marcus found Director Morrison's address easily enough, a modest cottage on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a well-maintained garden and a tall privacy fence. The former security director was clearly someone who took his personal security seriously, even in retirement. Marcus sat in his car for several minutes, observing the property and trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. Finally, he approached the front gate and pressed the intercom button. After a long pause, a gruff voice came through the speaker. "Yes, Mr. Morrison, my name is Marcus Webb. I'm currently working security at Meridian Palace, and I was hoping I could speak with you about some things that happened during your time as director." Another long pause. "I don't discuss my work at the palace, Mr. Drew. Webb. My service there is covered by confidentiality agreements that remain in effect." "Sir, I understand your position, but I've stumbled onto something that I think you'd want to know about. Someone has been tampering with official records from 1997, specifically files related to Princess Helena's accident." The silence that followed lasted so long that Marcus began to wonder if Morrison had simply walked away from the intercom. Finally, the gate buzzer sounded, and the former director's voice came through again. "Come to the front door. Come alone, and keep your hands visible." Marcus walked up the stone pathway to a heavy wooden door that opened before he could knock. James Morrison was a tall, lean man in his 70s with sharp eyes and the kind of bearing that suggested he was still capable of handling himself in a dangerous situation. He looked Marcus up and down carefully before stepping aside to let him enter. "Security badge," Morrison said simply. Marcus showed him his palace identification, which Morrison examined carefully before handing it back. "Sit down," the older man said, gesturing to a chair in a sparsely furnished living room. "Tell me exactly what you think you saw." Marcus recounted his discovery in the basement archives, describing the woman's activities and the conversation he had overheard about modifying official records. Morrison listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grim as the story unfolded. "This woman," Morrison said when Marcus finished. "Describe her again." "Blonde hair, expensive clothing, probably in her 40s. She knew my name and personal information about my family, and she had some kind of communication device to coordinate with accomplices. She seemed very familiar with the palace layout and security systems." Morrison was quiet for several minutes, staring out the window at his garden. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "Her name is Victoria Ashworth. She works for the Cabinet Office, officially as a historical research specialist, unofficially as a cleaner of inconvenient truths. If she was in those archives, it means someone very high up has decided that the 1997 files pose an active threat." "What really happened to Princess Helena?" Marcus asked directly. Morrison stood up and walked to the window, his back to Marcus. "What happened to Princess Helena is exactly why I took early retirement and why I've spent the last 27 years in this quiet little town, trying to forget what I know. Sir, someone is actively trying to erase the historical record. Whatever the truth is, don't the people of Valdoria have a right to know it? The people of Valdoria have a right to stability and peace," Morrison replied sharply. "Sometimes the truth serves those interests and sometimes it doesn't." "That's not your decision to make," Marcus said, surprising himself with his boldness. Morrison turned around, and Marcus could see decades of frustration and guilt in the older man's eyes. "You think I haven't been wrestling with that question every day for nearly 3 decades? You think I wanted to be part of a cover-up? Then tell me what really happened." Morrison returned to his chair and leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "What really happened is that Princess Helena discovered something she wasn't supposed to know, something that would have destroyed careers, brought down the government, and possibly destabilized the entire kingdom." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. "What did she discover?" evidence of systematic corruption at the highest levels of government. Financial records showing that several cabinet ministers and senior palace officials had been taking bribes from foreign governments and using their positions to influence policy decisions. Princess Helena had been conducting her own informal investigation into some irregularities she had noticed in charity fund allocations, and she stumbled onto a much bigger conspiracy. The riding accident was an attempt on her life, Morrison confirmed. Not by a foreign agent or a random assassin, but by someone she trusted. Someone who had access to the palace grounds and knowledge of her daily routine. The attack was designed to look like an accident, but the injuries she sustained were inconsistent with a fall from a horse. Marcus sat back in his chair, trying to process the magnitude of what Morrison was telling him. Who attacked her? That's where things get complicated, Morrison said grimly. The evidence pointed to multiple possible suspects, all of whom had both motive and opportunity. Rather than pursue a criminal investigation that would have exposed the broader corruption scandal, the decision was made at the very highest levels to treat it as an accident and quietly remove the most compromised officials from their positions. Princess Helena agreed to this? Princess Helena spent 3 weeks in a medically induced coma fighting for her life. By the time she was conscious enough to make decisions, the cover-up was already in place. She was presented with a choice: pursue justice and watch the kingdom tear itself apart in the resulting political chaos, or accept the official story and allow for a managed transition that preserves stability. And she chose stability. She chose to protect her people over her own desire for justice, Morrison said with obvious admiration. It was one of the most difficult decisions I've ever witnessed anyone make. Marcus thought about the implications of what he was hearing. But if the corrupt officials were quietly removed, wasn't justice served in the end?
Morrison shook his head. Some were removed, yes.
But others were too powerful or too well connected to touch directly. They were given warnings, had their activities more closely monitored, but remained in positions where they could continue to do damage. The corruption wasn't eliminated, Marcus. It was just driven deeper underground. And now someone is worried that the truth might come out. The people involved in the original cover-up are mostly dead or retired now, Morrison said, but their protégés and successors are still in positions of power, and many of them benefited from the system that Princess Helena discovered. If the truth about 1997 came to light, it would raise questions about who knew what and when, and how deep the corruption really went. Marcus understood now why Victoria Ashworth had been so confident, and why the threats against his family had been so casual. This wasn't just about historical records or past events. This was about protecting a network of people who were still in power, still benefiting from the system that Princess Helena had tried to expose. Why are you telling me this? Marcus asked. You've kept this secret for 27 years. Why break your silence now? Morrison was quiet for a long moment before answering. Because I'm 74 years old, Mr. Webb, and I'm tired of carrying this weight alone. Because Princess Helena deserved better than what she got. And because, if Victoria Ashworth is actively tampering with evidence, it means they're not content to let sleeping dogs lie. They're preparing for something. What kind of something? I don't know for certain, but I can guess. There have been rumors for months about investigations into financial irregularities in several government departments. Parliamentary committees asking questions about historical spending patterns. Journalists sniffing around old contracts and personnel decisions. If someone is methodically altering or destroying evidence from 1997, it's because they expect those records to be subpoenaed or requested through freedom of information laws. Marcus felt a chill of understanding. They're not just covering up the past, they're preparing to defend against current investigations. And they're willing to threaten your family to keep you quiet, Morrison added grimly, which tells me that whatever they're hiding is worth more to them than human decency or legal consequences. What should I do? Marcus asked. I have video evidence of Ashworth tampering with the files, but I don't know who I can trust to do anything about it. Morrison stood up and walked to an old wooden desk in the corner of the room. He pulled out a business card and handed it to Marcus. There's someone you need to meet. Someone who has been waiting 27 years for this conversation to happen. Marcus looked at the card. It contained only a name, Sarah Chen, and a phone number. Who is she? Sarah Chen was Princess Helena's private secretary in 1997. She was also the only person other than myself who knew the full truth about what happened. She left palace service shortly after the incident and has been working as an investigative journalist ever since. If anyone can help you navigate the situation safely, it's her. Why hasn't she exposed the truth herself? Because she made a promise to Princess Helena, just like I did.
But if the other side is breaking their end of the bargain by actively destroying evidence, then perhaps it's time for promises to be reconsidered.
Marcus pocketed the business card and stood to leave.
Mr. Morrison, if this does come out, what happens to Princess Helena? She's still alive, still a member of the royal family. Won't this destroy her life? Morrison smiled sadly. Princess Helena is 73 years old, Mr. Webb. She spent nearly 3 decades carrying the burden of that decision, wondering if she made the right choice. Maybe it's time for her to find out what the world would have looked like if she had chosen differently. As Marcus drove back toward the capital, he realized that his simple security job had evolved into something much more complex and dangerous. He was no longer just trying to protect himself and his daughter from immediate threats. He was now carrying information that could reshape the political landscape of Valdoria and potentially bring down people who had been operating with impunity for decades. The business card in his pocket felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Sarah Chen represented his next step toward either exposing a massive conspiracy or putting himself and his family in even greater danger. But Marcus knew he had passed the point where turning back was an option. Whatever happened next, he was committed to seeing this through to the end. Part 4. Sarah Chen's apartment was located in the historic district of the capital, in a converted warehouse that had been transformed into artist studios and professional offices. Marcus climbed 4 flights of stairs to reach her door, his nerves increasing with each step. The business card James Morrison had given him had led to a brief phone conversation in which Sarah had agreed to meet him, but her tone had been cautious and professional rather than welcoming. The woman who opened the door was in her early 60s, with graying black hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to take in everything about Marcus in the first few seconds of their meeting. She gestured for him to enter without speaking, then carefully locked the door behind him and activated what appeared to be a sophisticated security system. "You can never be too careful when discussing certain topics," Sarah said by way of explanation. "James Morrison said you have evidence that someone has been tampering with the 1997 files. Show me." Marcus pulled out his phone and played the video he had recorded in the palace archives. Sarah watched intently, occasionally pausing the recording to study particular details. When the video finished, she was quiet for several minutes before speaking. "That's definitely Victoria Ashworth," she confirmed. "And what she's doing is far worse than simple tampering. She's conducting what we call a historical sterilization, systematically removing or altering any evidence that contradicts an official narrative." "Morrison told me about Princess Helena's accident," Marcus said. "About the corruption investigation and the cover-up. He said you were the only other person who knew the full truth." Sarah moved to a large desk covered with newspapers, documents, and investigative notes. "What James told you is accurate as far as it goes, but it's not the complete story. There are layers to what happened in 1997 that even he doesn't know about." She pulled out a thick folder and set it on the desk between them. "I've spent the last 27 years investigating the network of corruption that Princess Helena discovered. What she found was just the tip of the iceberg." Marcus opened the folder and found himself looking at financial records, communication logs, and personnel files dating back to the mid-1990s. The document showed a pattern of irregular payments, policy decisions that benefited specific foreign companies, and a web of relationships connecting government officials to international business interests. "This goes beyond a few corrupt ministers taking bribes," Sarah continued. "This was a systematic infiltration of Valdoria's government by foreign intelligence services, using financial incentives to influence policy decisions. Princess Helena didn't just discover corruption, she discovered espionage." Marcus felt his understanding of the situation shift once again. "Foreign intelligence services?" "Primarily the Morvanian Intelligence Directorate," Sarah said, referring to Valdoria's historical rival and neighboring kingdom. "They had been running influence operations in our government for years, using a combination of bribery, blackmail, and strategic relationship building to gain access to sensitive information and influence policy decisions. And Princess Helena found evidence of this? She found a smoking gun. Financial records showing direct payments from Morvanian front companies to several high-ranking officials, along with communication logs proving that these officials were providing classified information about Valdoria's military capabilities, economic policies, and diplomatic strategies." Marcus scanned through the documents in the folder, trying to grasp the scope of what Sarah was describing. If this is true, why wasn't it exposed? "This is treason, not just corruption." Sarah's expression grew grim. "Because the investigation revealed that the Morvanian operation had been so successful that removing all the compromised officials would have left the government unable to function.
Cabinet ministers, military commanders, intelligence officials, even members of the royal household had been either corrupted or compromised, so they chose stability over justice.
They chose survival over principle, Sarah corrected.
The evidence Princess Helena discovered could have been used to expose the Morvanian operation, but doing so would have revealed the extent of Voldoria's vulnerability and potentially triggered a political crisis that Morvania could have exploited to their advantage. Marcus looked up from the documents. And the attack on Princess Helena was ordered by the Morvanian intelligence service when they realized she was getting too close to the truth. The attack wasn't carried out by a compromised Valdorian official. It was conducted by a Morvanian operative who had infiltrated the palace staff. This revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. So the cover-up wasn't just about protecting corrupt officials. It was about protecting national security. Exactly. Princess Helena and the senior leadership made a calculated decision to sacrifice justice for the individual victims in order to protect the kingdom as a whole. The Morvanian operation was quietly dismantled over the following months. The most seriously compromised officials were removed from sensitive positions, and counterintelligence measures were implemented to prevent similar infiltrations in the future. Marcus closed the folder, his mind reeling from the complexity of what he was learning. But if the Morvanian operation was dismantled, why is someone tampering with evidence now? Sarah walked to a window overlooking the street below, checking carefully for any signs of surveillance. Because the current government includes several officials who were junior members of the administration in 1997. They weren't directly involved in the Morvanian operation, but they benefited from the system that allowed it to flourish. More importantly, some of them have been engaged in similar activities with other foreign powers. The corruption didn't end with Morvania. It evolved and adapted. New players, new methods, but the same basic pattern of foreign influence and domestic collaboration. The people currently in power can't allow the 1997 files to be examined because doing so would expose the methods and networks that are still being used today. Marcus understood now why Victoria Ashworth had been so confident and why the threats against his family had been so casual. This wasn't just about historical records or past events. This was about protecting an ongoing system of corruption and foreign influence that reached the highest levels of the current government. What do we do with this information? Marcus asked. Sarah returned to her desk and pulled out another folder, this one containing more recent documents and photographs.
That depends on how committed you are to seeing this through and how much risk you're willing to accept for yourself and your daughter.
What kind of risk are we talking about? The kind where people disappear, Mr.
Webb, the kind where accidents happen and investigations reach convenient dead ends. The people currently in power have too much to lose to allow the truth about 1997 to come to light, and they have the resources and connections to make problems go away permanently. Marcus thought about Emma, probably doing her homework at his sister's house, completely unaware that her father was contemplating a decision that could change or end both their lives. But if we don't act, this system continues. More foreign influence, more corruption, more betrayal of the public trust. Yes, Sarah said simply. That's exactly what continues. Marcus looked through the folder of recent documents Sarah had shown him. The evidence of ongoing corruption and foreign influence was substantial and well documented, but it was also complex and technical in ways that would make it difficult for the general public to understand or for prosecutors to use effectively. We need the 1997 files, Marcus realized. The original documents show the pattern clearly, establish the methods, and demonstrate how long this has been going on. Without that historical context, these current activities just look like isolated incidents of corruption. Which is exactly why Victoria Ashworth was sanitizing the archives, Sarah confirmed. Remove the historical evidence, and the current activities can be explained away as unrelated ethical lapses, rather than part of a systematic pattern of foreign infiltration. Do you have copies of the original files? Sarah shook her head. I have some documents, but not the complete record. Princess Helena's personal files were transferred to a secure location shortly after the incident, and I never had access to the full investigative reports or photographic evidence. Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its clarity and determination. Then we need to get back into the archives before Ashworth finishes her work. That's incredibly dangerous, Sarah warned. Security has almost certainly been increased since your first encounter, and they'll be watching for any signs that you're continuing to investigate. Maybe, Marcus agreed, but I have advantages they don't know about. I know the palace layout better than any outsider, I have legitimate access to most areas, and they think they've already neutralized the threat by warning me off. Sarah studied Marcus carefully. You realize that once you take this step, there's no going back. Even if we succeed in exposing the truth, You'll never be able to return to your normal life. These people don't forgive, and they don't forget. Marcus thought about Emma again, but this time he also thought about the kind of country he wanted her to grow up in. A country where foreign powers could buy influence and corrupt officials could betray the public trust with impunity, or a country where the truth mattered more than the convenience of those in power. I understand, Marcus said. What do you need me to do? Sarah opened her laptop and began typing. First, we need to document everything we currently know and create multiple backup copies stored in secure locations. If something happens to either of us, this information needs to survive. She spent the next hour walking Marcus through a detailed plan for accessing and copying the remaining original documents from the 1997 files. The plan was complex and dangerous, requiring Marcus to use his security access to enter the archives during his regular shift, locate and photograph the documents before they could be further altered, and then transmit the information to Sarah using encrypted communication methods. The most critical element, Sarah emphasized, is that you can't deviate from your normal routine in any way that might attract attention. You need to conduct this operation during a regular shift, using your standard access routes, and you need to have a plausible explanation for any unusual activity. What about backup? Marcus asked. If something goes wrong, if Ashworth or her associates are monitoring the archives, then you need to be prepared to abandon the operation immediately, Sarah said firmly. The documents are important, but they're not worth your life. If you encounter any signs of surveillance or unusual security measures, you get out and we find another approach. As Marcus prepared to leave Sarah's apartment, she handed him a small device that looked like a smartphone but was clearly something more sophisticated. Encrypted communication system, she explained. It can't be monitored or tracked using conventional methods. Once you have the documents, use this to transmit them to me immediately. Don't try to carry physical copies out of the palace. The security risks are too high. Marcus pocketed the device and shook Sarah's hand. If we succeed, what happens next? Then we find out whether the people of Valdoria are ready to learn the truth about their government, Sarah said. And we find out whether Princess Helena's sacrifice 27 years ago was worth the cost. As Marcus walked back to his car, he realized that he was about to attempt something that would either expose one of the most significant political conspiracies in Valdorian history or result in his own disappearance. The stakes couldn't be higher, but for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Marcus felt like he was taking action rather than simply reacting to threats. Tomorrow night, during his regular shift at Meridian Palace, he would either become a hero or a casualty. Either way, the truth about 1997 would finally have a chance to see the light of day.